You're under investigation for an excessive quantity of zucchini. I blinked at the letter in my hand, then read it again, just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. Nope, it was still there, in an overly aggressive font, printed on HOA letterhead. My crime? Unauthorized agricultural expansion leading to community disruption. What did that even mean? Was I suspected of running an underground black market for cucumbers? Had my tomatoes radicalized the neighborhood? I stepped onto my back porch and surveyed the supposed criminal empire I had built, a modest vegetable garden. Sure, it was a little ambitious. I had tomatoes, peppers, corn, squash, and even a small herb section. But was it worthy of an official complaint? It wasn't like I was running a pumpkin smuggling ring out of my garage. Then came the knock on my door. Karen McAllister, the HOA president, stood there in all her terrifying glory, thick binder in one hand, phone in the other, and a smug expression that suggested she was about to ruin someone's day and was really going to enjoy it. Behind her, 2 other board members hovered like obedient vultures, nodding at whatever nonsense she was about to say. Mr. Thompson, she began, with the same tone someone might use to address a repeat offender, we've received multiple complaints about your farming activities. I glanced at my backyard, then back at her. You mean my garden? Karen's lips thinned. Your illegal expansion of agricultural crops, yes. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. There's no rule against gardens. She made a dramatic show of flipping through her binder, then turned the page around, stabbing a finger at a line of text. Homeowners are required to maintain their property in a manner consistent with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I stared. And you think tomatoes are a threat to aesthetic harmony? She sniffed. You have corn growing taller than the fence. It's practically a security risk. Security risk? I repeated, struggling to process the absurdity. Are you afraid burglars are going to use my corn stalks for cover? Maybe some radicalized zucchinis will storm the HOA meeting. The board members behind her murmured in agreement. One even took a dramatic step back, as though my rogue vegetables might attack at any moment. Karen crossed her arms. You have 1 week to remove the unauthorized crops, or we'll be issuing fines. I folded my arms right back. Show me the exact rule that says I can't have a garden. There was a flicker of something, hesitation, annoyance, before she quickly masked it with a tight smile. It falls under property beautification standards. You're in violation. I grinned. Oh, so it's not actually written anywhere? Karen's eye twitched. It is implied. That's funny, I said, scratching my head. I read the rulebook before moving in. Didn't see anything about vegetable gardens. And fun fact, implied rules don't hold up in court. A flicker of uncertainty passed through the board members. Karen, however, wasn't about to back down. You have 1 week, she repeated. And with that, she turned on her heel and stalked off, her minions following behind like well-trained parrots. I shut the door, exhaled, and immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop. As I suspected, there was nothing about gardens, crops, or rogue zucchinis. So, naturally, I ignored the warning. A week later, the first fine arrived, $200 for failure to remove excessive agricultural growth. 2 days after that, another fine, $300 for ongoing noncompliance with community standards. Then came the notices. They taped them to my door. Stuffed them in my mailbox. One particularly aggressive board member even left one on my windshield. By the end of the month, I had accumulated nearly $5,000 in fines. The real kicker? My neighbors were loving my garden. One of them, an elderly man named Frank, came by to barter home-baked bread for fresh tomatoes. A couple down the street thanked me for the free herbs. My produce was feeding the neighborhood, and the only people who had a problem with it were the HOA tyrant. Then things escalated. One morning, I stepped outside and saw Karen and a few HOA members inspecting my garden with clipboards. "What are you doing?" I called, marching toward them. Karen barely looked up. "Documenting evidence." For what? She snapped a photo of my cucumbers. For the upcoming lawsuit. I almost tripped over a squash vine. Lawsuit. Karen smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you double-check if your tires had been slashed. You've left us no choice. The HOA is officially suing you for failure to comply with community regulations. I stared at her, waiting for her to yell, "Gotcha!" or laugh or anything that would suggest she wasn't completely out of her mind. But no. She was serious. They were taking me to court over vegetables. Now I could have panicked. I could have ripped out my plants, apologized, and thrown myself at the mercy of the HOA overlord. Instead, I did something much better. I hired a lawyer. Gregory Bell, attorney at law, was the best and pettiest legal mind I could find. His entire career revolved around fighting HOA abuse cases, and he took personal joy in dismantling their ridiculous claims. The moment I showed him the paperwork, he laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "This is a gold mine," he said, flipping through the documents. "You're telling me they find you based on a rule that doesn't exist?" "Yep." Greg grinned. "We're going to destroy them." And just like that, the war against the HOA Garden Gestapo had officially begun. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that by suing me, she had just opened the biggest can of worms imaginable. Because when you try to enforce rules that don't exist, the legal system tends to take that personally. So I prepared for battle. And the courtroom was about to get very, very interesting. Gregory Bell was the kind of lawyer who thrived on absurdity. The moment I handed him the HOA's lawsuit, he treated it like Christmas morning, flipping through the pages with a gleam in his eye. He whistled low, shaking his head as he read through Karen's claims. "They're really going all in," he muttered, turning another page. "Excessive agricultural expansion? Threat to property values? Community disruption? What? Did you start a farm-to-table restaurant in your backyard?" "I gave Frank 3 tomatoes," I said. Greg laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was the kind of laugh that signaled someone was about to have way too much fun at someone else's expense. "This is perfect," he said, slapping the papers down. "They don't have a case. They don't even have a real rule. They made it up, fined you for it, and now they're trying to drag you into court. We're going to make them regret every single second of this." I wasn't entirely convinced. "You're sure?" I asked. "Because I don't trust them to play fair." Greg looked at me like I had just handed him the world's dumbest question. "They already haven't played fair," he said. "And that's exactly why they're going to lose." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, the HOA did everything in their power to intimidate me. The fines kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. $400 for vegetative obstruction of property symmetry. $600 for unauthorized use of soil. A full $1,000 fine for continued noncompliance with neighborhood farming restrictions, which was especially impressive considering there were no neighborhood farming restrictions. The night before the hearing, I saw Karen standing at the end of my driveway, talking to one of the HOA board members. She saw me watching, smirked, and pulled out her phone to snap another picture of my backyard. I smiled back, because tomorrow she was about to get the legal smackdown of a lifetime. Courtrooms were supposed to be serious places, but as soon as the judge entered and Karen took the stand, the whole thing started feeling like a bad sitcom. She arrived with a full PowerPoint presentation and a stack of evidence that included grainy, zoomed-in photos of my garden like she had caught me running an illegal corn cartel. She clicked through slides, explaining in dramatic detail how my vegetables were destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. The best part? She had brought expert testimony from an HOA compliance specialist, which turned out to be her cousin Greg, a guy who worked in HR for a mattress company and had exactly zero legal expertise. Greg Bell nearly choked on his own laughter. "My client," he said once it was his turn, "is being fined for breaking a rule that does not exist. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not an interpretation of policy. This is fraud. The judge frowned. Mr. Bell, are you suggesting the HOA has fabricated regulations? Greg pulled out the official, unaltered HOA rulebook, handed a copy to the judge, and flipped to the landscaping section. This is the rulebook from before my client moved in, he said. Nowhere does it state that he cannot have a vegetable garden. It mentions lawn maintenance, tree height, and acceptable exterior paint colors, but absolutely nothing about crops. Karen, sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table, barely flinched. The HOA board recently passed an addendum, she said. Greg's smile widened. Yes, he said, they did. And according to community bylaws, HOA rule changes must be voted on by a majority of homeowners. Was this rule voted on? Karen hesitated. That's irrelevant, she finally said. The judge arched an eyebrow. It's actually extremely relevant. Greg flipped to another document. This, he said, holding up a copy of the HOA's most recent amendments, was printed last week. My client was fined for violating this rule well before that. Meaning, once again, the HOA has been issuing penalties based on a non-existent regulation. Karen's face turned an impressive shade of red. This is outrageous, she snapped. Our job is to maintain community standards. We have full discretion. The HOA does not have discretion to make up laws and enforce them retroactively, the judge interrupted. If there was no rule in place at the time of these fines, then these fines are not legally enforceable. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The judge turned to me. Mr. Thompson, have you been financially affected by these improper fines? I tried not to grin. Yes, Your Honor. The fines were aggressive and frequent. I've also experienced harassment from the HOA, including unauthorized surveillance and attempts to intimidate me. Greg pulled out his final piece of evidence, a printout of all the fines I had received, each one increasing in absurdity. The judge flipped through them, shaking her head. $1,000 for soil usage? She read aloud. Are you serious? Karen, looking more and more like a malfunctioning robot, stammered. Well, this is a clear community matter. No, the judge said flatly. This is an abuse of power. Karen's mouth snapped shut. The courtroom was silent. The judge adjusted her glasses and sighed. The fines are voided, she announced. Furthermore, Mr. Thompson, you are entitled to reimbursement for all penalties paid. Additionally, if you wish to file a counterclaim for damages, you may do so. Karen's face went from red to white. Your Honor, she started. Surely. The judge held up a hand. This hearing is over. Karen slumped back in her seat. Greg leaned over and whispered, You want to go for damages? I bet we could get enough to fund an expansion. I smiled. Oh, we're not done yet. The court ruling was like a shot heard around the neighborhood. The news spread faster than I could have imagined. By the time I returned home, my phone was flooded with texts, voicemails, and emails. Most of them were from neighbors who had been quietly rooting for me but didn't want to get involved in what they saw as a ridiculous battle between me and the HOA. Frank, the elderly man who had been trading me bread for tomatoes, called me the second I stepped through the door. Tom, he said, his voice trembling with excitement. I heard the news. You beat them. You beat the HOA. Yeah, I said, still trying to process the fact that I had just won an absurdly dramatic court case. I did. You know what this means, right? Frank asked. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. It means we can plant whatever we want now. No more corn police. I chuckled. I'm not sure the corn police ever existed, Frank. But you're right. We're free. But the victory didn't stop there. The next day, I filed a counterclaim for damages. The HOA's harassment had cost me more than money. It had made me feel like an outsider in my own home, like I was a criminal for trying to enjoy my garden. So, when Greg told me we had a chance to hit them where it really hurt, their wallets, I didn't hesitate. What I didn't anticipate was how the counterclaim would unravel Karen's entire world. She had already been publicly humiliated in the courtroom, but I had no idea just how much damage my lawsuit would do to the HOA's reputation. Karen, who had long thought of herself as the invincible queen of suburban conformity, found herself under attack from every angle. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to stand up to her before began sending emails to the HOA board, demanding accountability. A few even circulated petitions, calling for Karen's resignation. But the real blow came when a local news outlet caught wind of the story. The headline read, "Suburban HOA sued for fabricating laws to fine homeowners over gardens." The piece was filled with quotes from residents who were just as outraged as I had been about the HOA's overreach. It painted Karen as the villain, the power-hungry dictator who had tried to destroy someone's life over a patch of tomatoes. When I read the article, I couldn't help but laugh. Karen had zero control over this narrative now. The community had turned on her, and there was nothing she could do about it. Then came the moment that would have been sweet enough to make any legal victory even more satisfying. One afternoon, I received a letter from the HOA. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a warning. It was a formal resignation from Karen McAllister as the president of the HOA. Apparently, the pressure from the community had become too much, and Karen, along with the board members who had backed her, were being forced out. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. When I saw the news online, I couldn't resist a text to Frank. "You were right," I wrote. "No more corn police. And Karen's out." He called me right away and we shared a laugh. "Well, Tom, it looks like you've finally turned the tables. Just don't go planting a forest in your backyard, all right? I don't want to see you getting another lawsuit." "I'll stick to the zucchini for now," I said with a grin. "But I've got plans." And speaking of plans, after Karen's resignation, the HOA was left leaderless. Without her iron fist, the rest of the board members fell into disarray. A power vacuum was created, and that's when I saw my chance to really shake things up. I didn't want to take over the HOA. That wasn't my style. But I knew that if I pushed for transparency, community involvement, and fair regulations, I could make a real difference in the neighborhood. The new board members, who were all completely overwhelmed by the sudden leadership shift, welcomed the idea. Before long, I had managed to gather a group of homeowners who shared my vision for a better, more open HOA. We discussed how to avoid situations like mine in the future and how we could establish clearer rules that everyone could agree on. It felt good to know that the community was moving toward a more reasonable and democratic structure, rather than one ruled by fear and arbitrary fines. But even as I worked on these changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed one final act of sweet, petty revenge. So, I planned a block party. It started innocently enough. I sent out invitations to everyone on the street, promising fresh food from my garden. My neighbors were excited. No one had ever done anything like this before, and they were eager to see what all the fuss had been about. Then I had an idea. What if, at the block party, I made it known that this entire event was brought to you by the unapproved, excessively large garden in my backyard? What if I subtly let everyone know that the neighborhood was thriving, because of vegetables? I invited Frank to bake bread. I had my tomatoes lined up for salads, my cucumbers for pickles, and my peppers for a hearty salsa. And of course, I had an entire grilled zucchini platter ready to go. The day of the block party arrived, and as I set up in my backyard, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just a party. This was my victory lap. I had gone from being sued over vegetables to throwing a garden-centered feast for an entire neighborhood. Neighbors arrived in droves, and the atmosphere was electric. Karen was nowhere to be seen, probably still licking her wounds from her abrupt departure. The food was fantastic, the music was lively, and before I knew it, I had completely transformed the narrative of my garden. At one point, I heard someone ask, "So, Tom, what's next? Another vegetable army to fight the HOA?" I chuckled. Nah, no need for that. The HOA's been taken care of. But I might expand a bit. You know, for the people. As the night drew on, and my neighbors happily devoured my garden-grown vegetables, I realized something. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or getting revenge on a tyrannical HOA president. It was about community, about bringing people together despite the petty, ridiculous challenges we faced. And in the end, it was my garden, the very thing that had once put me at odds with the neighborhood, that had united everyone. And as I stood there, surrounded by friends, old and new, I couldn't help but smile. Karen may have thought she could crush me with her rules and her fines, but she had never counted on one thing: the power of a good zucchini.